Welcome to Lesson 2 in Unit 25, Science in St. Louis. In this lesson, students will answer the question, how do the characteristics of the Arch Riverfront ecosystem affect the survival of living things? Students are going to look at the characteristics of the riverfront ecosystem and talk about the adaptations that organisms need to make to survive in this ecosystem. They'll also spend time looking at the characteristics of the organisms that thrive in this ecosystem and the organisms that do not survive in this ecosystem. In the Engage part of this lesson, students will be given a list of animals that live at two different parts of the riverfront system. Animals that live in the downtown Arch Riverfront system, and then animals that live in the Confluence Riverfront system. Students will be asked if they notice any patterns or trends on this list, and if they have any questions about these two lists. In the Explore part of this lesson, students are going to look at riverfront animal cards, look at the characteristics that these riverfront animals possess, and then draw what they think an ideal riverfront ecosystem will look like. Here are some examples of those riverfront ecosystem cards that the students will be looking at. It will have a picture of the animal, along with the adaptations and the habitat needs of these animals. Students will use this information to draw a model of the habitat they think these organisms would be best suited in. In the Explain part of this lesson, students will view images of the ecosystem they just drew a model of and compare to see how close they were to the actual ecosystem. Students will then complete a reading on riverfront ecosystems that looks at the two major rivers in Missouri, the Missouri River and the Mississippi River. They'll look at the characteristics of those specific riverfront ecosystems and the type of animals that live there. In the Elaborate portion of this lesson, you'll show students this slide. This slide shows the riverfront ecosystem at the Arch, the two pictures on the left, and the riverfront ecosystem at the Confluence, the two pictures on the right. Students will talk about the differences in these riverfronts. They'll talk about the list they saw at the very beginning of this lesson that showed the different animals that live at these two very different riverfronts, and they'll talk about the characteristics that the animals living at these riverfronts need to survive. Students will then work in groups to construct an argument about the organisms that survive well, those that survive less well, and those that do not survive at all at the Arch Riverfront ecosystem. They'll use a claim evidence reasoning format to construct their argument. This will give them practice for their Evaluate portion of this lesson. While students are constructing their argument, encourage them to use evidence from the list at the beginning of this lesson, the cards they were given, and their reading. We want them to stick to the facts as they construct their argument. In the Evaluate portion of this lesson, students will complete a CER about the East St. Louis riverfront. Students will read a scenario about how directly across from the St. Louis Arch, there's a part of the Illinois riverfront that's a little more natural than our Arch riverfront. Students will read about the characteristics of the leopard frog, and then look at the East St. Louis side of the riverfront and the St. Louis side of the riverfront to determine how that leopard frog would survive in both ecosystems. Students will then use evidence from the reading and the characteristics of the leopard frog to support their answer. By the end of this lesson, students will have spent time looking at a particular ecosystem and the adaptations that organisms have to make to survive well in that ecosystem.